Hey peeps, Robert Costa here, aka Groove Mechanic from GMaudio and Fixation Studios. There's been a few people asking questions on social media about GMaudio Ducker and what makes this device better than other techniques of sidechaining or volume shaping or ducking, whatever you want to call it. But essentially, the goal is to duck the volume of the bass when the kick hits. Obviously, this can be used to do more than just duck bass out of the way of a kick. It could be used to gate synthesizers or create new rhythms in any signal essentially. But really, all we're doing is changing the volume incredibly quickly based on what's happening in another signal. And to compare these processes, I've frozen and flattened an analog kick. So it's analog in the sense that the oscillators don't reset. But what I have done is I've duplicated that audio across all of these copies. And I've done the same thing with the bass. And this way, every single comparison is exactly the same because it's done with audio rather than a synthesizer. For the different comparisons, I've got GMaudio Ducker first, and then I've got sidechain compression, and then I've got gate using a sidechain, and then I've got what I think is the best tool for the job in VST format, which is Devious Machine's Duck. Now there's problems with all of these processes except for GMaudio Ducker, and I'll show you exactly what I mean by that. Now I've automated all of these effects on and off so that I can do one recording and then compare every scenario. Now I'll quickly just give you an example of what this sounds like without any processing whatsoever. So this is the kick and bass combined. So both the kick and bass go in and out of phase because they're both kind of analog in the way that the oscillators don't reset. Plus there's changes in pitch, which also changes the phase. And what I mean by phase is that the waveform might be moving in the opposite direction to the other signal, which therefore when they sum together, cancel each other out, occasionally, only in parts. And the only way to get around that, what's called destructive interference between two signals, is to completely mute one while the other one is playing. Okay, I won't say too much more. Let's just record these examples and compare them all in the recording so we can see the waveforms. Okay, cool. Let's just quickly look at each of these examples. So I've got GMaudio Ducker, which is doing the very minimum that it can do to do a clean ducking. So as described in the description on Gumroad, that settings or values of 100 for both the amount and the release will ensure that the volume is completely reduced for every kick transient. Now the release can go a little bit shorter, but I've left it at 100 milliseconds for now because that's the kind of default setting. Now with the sidechain compressor, I've had to stack up 3 on top of each other so that way I could get a significant amount of gain reduction, because otherwise I'm only going to be able to dip the volume about 9 decibels. So you can see here that I'm getting 9 decibels of gain reduction, and to do that I've had to EQ the sidechain so it's just listening to the top end, so I get the transient. I've had to boost the sidechain signal, and I've set the look ahead to 10 milliseconds, and I've set the release to 20 milliseconds. So I'm trying to pick the settings that are the minimum for avoiding distortion, essentially. And to get it closer to full ducking of the volume, I've duplicated it 3 times. So combined, those 9 decibels, that's roughly 27 dB of gain reduction. So almost 30 dB of gain reduction, which is nowhere near the same as these others. And we'll see kind of how this sounds compared to the other processes. So there's also the sidechain gate, which someone mentioned on social media. So that one is completely ducking the volume because I've set the floor to -infinity for every kick transient. And that, almost works. And then for this last example, using Devious Machine's Duck, which is an awesome plugin and actually has a lot of features that other plugins don't have. For this fourth example, it's using a MIDI trigger. And then for this fifth example, it's using sidechain transient detection. So this is as close as possible to GMaudio Ducker, but it's still not very accurate. And I'll show you that in the recording. So I'll just jump on over to the audio clip that we've just recorded. Let's have a little listen to just the bass first, right? And I'm just going to apply this EQ so you can hear the click that has been introduced by some of these processes. So let's have a listen to it at the start here. That's GMaudio Ducker. No clicks. Cool. Next one. We can hear the clicking. So there's clicks and there's kind of a little bit of a, almost like vacuum, like a sucking back effect. So that was the sidechain compression, which, yeah, you can't get no clicks with sidechain compression. What makes it inaccurate is that with compression, this attack in 10 milliseconds, so that isn't the time it takes to reach the maximum gain reduction. That is a smoothing effect which is applied to the gain reduction curve. So as soon as you turn up the attack, you're reducing its accuracy because you're really just taking an average over 10 milliseconds, and that value that is output, that is the new gain reduction curve. So it'll never reach the peak gain reduction curve that it can because it has this smoothing applied, and it's always going to slow things down. Not to mention that if your kick is different each time, then that smoothing is going to be different each time, and yeah, it just doesn't work. So not only can you not avoid clicks, you can never get the sufficient amount of gain reduction for proper volume shaping or ducking to occur. Then this gate, we'll have a listen to this. So the pops and clicks are almost non-existent. It's very subtle. It's close, but the problem with this is that the actual gain reduction curve, again, isn't very accurate. And if I turn this on, so this is an updated version of GMaudio Ducker, which will be released soon. So while doing these tests, I just found a couple of situations where GMaudio Ducker wasn't reacting how I would expect. So I've made a few little tweaks, and I've added this extra visualization to the oscilloscope, which shows the absolute peak volume averaged over time so that you can see essentially the ducking curve or the absolute volume curve of both the kick and bass combined. But I'm just going to use it to compare the volume shaping that's been applied by each of these processes. So let's have a look at this sidechain gate. So have a look at this curve here, right? It's got a fair bit of fade in and a fair bit of fade out, and there's quite a bit of hold, so it's ducking, keeping the volume down for longer. Whereas if I compare that to this, the fade in time is a lot less and the hold time is a lot less. And I've actually set this sidechain gate to the shortest possible settings to minimize distortion and no hold time. So minimum hold time, 1 millisecond. Look ahead, 10 milliseconds. Release time, 10 milliseconds. Attack, 10 milliseconds. These are all the same. GMaudio Ducker actually has a 10 millisecond fade in on the volume envelope. And for that reason, it has a 10 millisecond latency so that it can duck before the kick transient hits. Yeah, again, not very accurate. Better with the pops and clicks, but not accurate in the actual volume shaping curve that it applies. So then what's left is duck with the MIDI triggering and sidechain gate triggering. Let's have a listen to how these sound. So no pops and clicks, which is great. This one here. Also no pops and clicks. So that's awesome. The smoothing on Devious Machine's Duck is turned all the way up, and that's what it is at default. By turning it down a little bit less, you can kind of get a little bit more accuracy with the envelope, so the actual volume curve that it applies, but it is very difficult to balance it between pops and clicks and accuracy. So it's generally somewhere between 3/4 and full, and it may change between different signals. But because it defaults to 100% smoothing, I've left it at 100% smoothing, which completely eradicates pops and clicks. So it's probably been the best tool so far. But let's look at the combined waveform. So I'll bring up clip view, and this is the recording of both signals summed together. So I'm just going to zoom in a bit, and you can see here, look at the kick transient, right? Exactly the same each time. Okay, there will be very, very subtle variations because it is an analog style kick, so the oscillators are slightly different each time, but even still, you can see how consistent that kick transient remains. It's pretty much identical throughout the entire recording. So that's GMaudio Ducker, the first example. Then the second one is the sidechain compression, and we'll see that it goes a little bit skewed here and there. Some will be higher than others. And that's where there'll be more pops and clicks. So there's subtle differences. Sometimes the top will be a little bit higher, sometimes the bottom will be a little bit lower. See, it's just slightly skewed. And if we listen, you'll be able to subtly hear the pops and clicks as well. There's almost like an extra click at the start of the kick some of the time. Slight variation in the kick transient. There's the pops and clicks in the audio, and you can never get the gain reduction curve accurate because of the smoothing of a compressor, which is just the nature of how it works. So then what about the sidechain gate? We can have a look at that, and we can again see that there's very subtle variations at the start of each kick transient, which shows us that the accuracy of the volume envelope isn't ideal. So a little bit lower here, a little bit higher there. Again, a lot lower here. And the problem with this one was that it was holding that volume down for too long, so we couldn't get an accurate gain reduction curve. And then the MIDI sidechain ducking using Davis Machine's duck, we can see that the variation in the kick transient is a lot worse. So here it's gone down quite low, then sometimes it's cancelling out and being a bit smaller. Here it's a little bit higher at the top here. So each time it's changing quite consistently. So while there's no pops and clicks and the curve can be relatively accurate, the timing is definitely off. And every single time the kick hits, the bass and the kick are combining in constructive and deconstructive ways to change the kick transient. So MIDI triggering is never going to be as accurate as a sidechain transient detection. So let's have a look at Davis Machine's duck sidechain transient detection then. And even still, we can see that each of these kicks is slightly different. Here we can see a very low peak, and then each time you can see this kick transient changing. So no pops and clicks, but not a consistent kick transient. And Davis Machine's duck has the same 10 milliseconds look ahead that GMaudio Ducker does. They've only recently added that feature of being able to have look ahead. And it may be possible that after this video, they actually make some changes to their plugin that makes it a little bit more accurate. But currently, the only way to get accurate sidechain ducking in Ableton Live is using a tool like GMaudio Ducker. And GMaudio Ducker is simpler to use. There's much fewer settings. There's not much necessity to change anything with the sidechain signal. It's already filtered so that it's perfectly triggered with kicks. And if you do come across a scenario where your kick isn't triggering GMaudio Ducker as well as it maybe should, then shoot me an email with a screenshot and maybe an Ableton Live set, and I can maybe tweak the sidechain filtering a little bit more, but I haven't found a situation where it's not triggering correctly yet. So along with these new changes that I've made, just making it a little bit more accurate in all scenarios, and the visualization, making it easier to tweak the parameters, in my opinion, there isn't a better tool for this job. And I've got one more example to show you in another project. So let's have a look at that. Cool, so in this project, I have two operators. It's all just sine waves, just keeping it really simple, kind of clinical, controlled. So I've got a kick, basically a sine wave with a pitch envelope. And then I have a bass, which is the same note without the pitch envelope, just sustained. So with GMaudio Ducker off, you can hear it's just a sine wave, right? So let's hear how both of these combine. So this is with no volume shaping or ducking at all. We're getting a peak volume of roughly -6 dB. And you can hear that the kick kind of gets cancelled out by the bass. So the kick has less bass, but as the kick and bass combine, there is a kind of much higher peak volume. But when I introduce GMaudio Ducker, let's hear how that sounds. So the kick has more body, and we actually have a lower peak volume. So it's at -8 dB. So we've gained 2 dB of headroom and got a fuller kick. And I can use a key on my keyboard to actually switch between those. So with it off, and then with the 2 dB boost and the ducking, so like I mentioned in the description, getting more headroom, which means more bass. So I also wanted to compare automation. That's one of the things that someone mentioned on social media. Now, I'm just going to solo this bass channel for a second. And that click there is in the actual original audio. That's because this sine wave abruptly kind of stops and is reset with the start of the note. And it was very difficult for me to eradicate that. So I just minimized it as much as possible. But have a listen to what happens when I adjust this chain volume. So this is one way of doing volume automation, just an empty audio effect rack and setting the chain's volume as a macro, and then you can automate this, right? So have a listen to what happens when I change this while the bass is playing. You can obviously hear that distortion, right? And I've got an EQ on here to reduce the low end and boost the top end to make it a bit more obvious. So with it off, pretty much as long as I'm moving the dial, you can hear that there's some distortion. It almost sounds a little bit like bit crushing or like quantization effects. And that's because that control is actually stepping. There isn't much smoothing between the parameter changes. I assume that Ableton would have implemented some smoothing, but it's not enough for volume to minimize distortion. So I'll leave that at 0 and we'll use Ableton's utility instead. And I've drawn in a shape here. So it's ducking just before the kick, and it's got a short amount of hold time, and then it's coming back up, right? Let's have a listen to how that sounds. With this off. So that's pretty good. There is a little bit of click in there, but it's mainly from the original audio. But we still have the problem of stepping and there being distortion as we move this dial. So this is pretty accurate at the moment. Now this is a very empty project, so there isn't anything adding latency, which may very well skew this automation and generally does. So that's, an issue. And also trying to get or draw the automation so accurately is always going to be an issue. And if you're not doing 4-on-the-floor music, then trying to do automation for every kick is going to be an absolute pain. So while this is good in some respects, it obviously falls short again. But let's turn on this EQ and listen out for this distortion again. So anytime that it's automating the volume, there's still that stepping distortion. It's unavoidable. Whereas if we compare that to this example here, absolutely no stepping distortion because the envelope is generated on a sample by sample basis and is smoothed using a logarithmic curve, which is ideal for amplitude envelopes, plus much easier to set up than doing any kind of automation. So automation can be accurate, but it introduces distortion. GMaudio Ducker won't. And yeah, GMaudio Ducker isn't affected by latency of other plugins. Even sidechain compression isn't, but then, you've got those other issues with it. So like I said, this is really the only way if you want to get accurate sidechain ducking of a signal, and it's much easier to use than any other device, whether it be native or Max for Live device out there. Kind of dry, boring examples, but I hope that answers a few questions, and I will ship out this new version of GMaudio Ducker very soon. Hit subscribe if you want to keep updated about my Max for Live devices and want to see some tips and tricks on how to use them. That's it for now. Thanks for watching.